Hello. So, my name's Chris Wright. I'm Chief Exec, CEO of Games Analytics, and what I want to talk about is really kind of going beyond where Florrie was talking about on the last presentation. So, I know there's be some really interesting presentations about analytics, about metrics, about collecting events, about how you can start to use that. Games Analytics, we're a data mining company. We're completely focused on delivering value and helping companies understand the players and then monetize those players. So I'd like to talk a little bit about a technique called predictive analytics, which is where you can actually start to take the metrics that Florrie were talking about and other companies have been talking about and really take it to the next level and start to drive actions out of that. How do I change these metrics? And this is really important. It's not just about understanding users and seeing how people are spending money and what they're doing and what the average revenue per user is and what the daily active user is and all of these endless metrics. It's actually how do I change those numbers? How do I increase my retention rate? How do I improve my monetization? Where are my users hitting problems? And how do I solve them? And analytics is really powerful for actually giving you actions from that. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that, some of the technology we have, and some of the techniques we're using to start to do that. So a little bit about who we are, what is analytics, what is predictive modeling and player segmentation. There was some talk in the last talk about segmenting the user base, but we go much further than that. How do you actually start to build these? How do you personalize the experience? Because analytics opens up a huge opportunity for games. As we start moving from a product-based industry to a service-based industry, we can start to really understand our players, and then we can start to adapt our games based on that. And then what does that lead to, and where is the future? So as Games Analytics, we are a combination of a lot of expertise from the games industry and a lot of expertise from data mining. We come from those two areas. We don't come from web or from other social sides. We come from core games and core data mining expertise, and we really see ourselves as fundamentally a data mining company. And we have a technology that allows us to collect, analyze, and then engage with users. And I'll talk about how we do that and the driving force of this, which is predictive modeling. So what is analytics? Google Analytics kind of started this, and they were presenting out dashboards, and everybody is, I'm sure, very aware of dashboards that you can now get from a lot of companies. Analytics is really about understanding the users, understanding and making decisions. And this was just a quote I found from Wikipedia, but I think it's actually a really good quote because it's not about just collecting data and visualizing it. And we call that metrics. We call that, understanding what's happening is good, but analytics allows you to go further than that. It allows you to really start to delve into different kinds of players and look at what they're doing on an individual level or a group level, and then looking at how do you action those results. So it's not just about dashboards. It's not easy. I mean, when you start doing this, you very quickly realize that there's some massive challenges when you start collecting data and when you start trying to analyze it. You've got huge amounts of data. So we, and a lot of these companies are what's kind of classed as a big data company. So we collect millions, hundreds of millions of events from games, terabytes of data, and being able to process, hold data warehouse, and then analyze that is a huge challenge. And a lot of the techniques and technologies are coming directly from companies like Yahoo, from Google, from Facebook, from Twitter. The ability to look at that and analyze it, and using technologies like Hadoop, Vertica, these sorts of big data technologies are absolutely key, and if you're going to start to understand that data. And what we're looking for is complex player behavior. So we're really interested not in who's downloading the game or what is their demographic, but what are they doing in the game? How are they playing the game? How are they interacting with the game? What kind of player behaviors are they producing? And this is very different from traditional data mining. So data mining will generally, from the banks and the retail, which is a lot of our background, they'll generally look at the demographics, the user base, and say this is a 25-year-old male or a 33-year-old female, and they bought this and this, and so therefore we understand what they're going to buy. With games, we have very little demographic information. We know very little about the user, but what we do know is huge amounts about the behavior, what they're doing, how are they playing the game, where are they getting stuck, where are they buying, what is the difference between somebody who spends money, the 2% of players who actually spend any money in a freemium game, and the 98% of players who don't. And how can we identify those behaviors? How can we recognize those players? There are lots of monetization mechanics, and how do they work? How do they target? Because this isn't just a standard set of users. When you have 1 million or 2 million people playing a game, they're not all the same. There's lots of different players who are playing the games for lots of different reasons. Some of these are socializing players. They're not, have no interest in spending money, but they're holding social groups together. They're encouraging people in, they're being viral, and they're holding the people who spend money in the game. So you've got to have different kinds of techniques and different kinds of mechanics for different types of users. There's an overall focus on whales. Everybody talks about the people who spend hundreds of dollars in a game, and the ARPU is this massive split between the people who spend large amounts of money and those who spend tiny percentages of money. And everybody knows that most of these games are driven by the whales. But there's real opportunities to start to expand that, so you're not so dependent on a very small slither of users, but you can expand out the range. You can start looking at a much wider set of users and a much wider set of behaviors. And ultimately, this is about making that data valuable. So people are now, over the last 2 years, they're getting the understanding of collecting data. What the next step is how to really drive value out of that data. You have to own the data. It's really important that you collect and you own the data, either yourself or you work with a company who collects it directly for you. Because that data is probably the most important thing you have. It tells you what your users like, what your users don't like, what's good about your game, what's bad about your game. And I've been in the games industry for 15, 20 years, and I've worked on a lot of games, console games, and I never did know why somebody liked my game, they didn't like my game. I've done games that have been very successful, and I've done follow-ups that have been very unsuccessful. And we really didn't know. We had no idea why people liked it. Was it the marketing? Was it the game? Was it a specific feature of the game that we never put into the follow-on title? Now we have that data. We can understand much better what our users are doing, and that's really important. So, dashboards. Dashboards almost never give you the information you need. They give you very good general information. They tell you the overall health of the game. And we talk about this as, this is the average player. They tell you information that is old. They tell you stuff that happened yesterday, last week, last month. It's good information. It definitely gives you value, but it doesn't really allow you to answer those questions of, okay, I now know I have a problem. I have a health check to my game, which is great, but how do I solve it? How do I move those metrics? How do I change them? How do I make people want to play the game longer, improve my retention? How do I get people to spend more money? A/B testing is another side a lot of people talk about, and ultimately, A/B testing is about putting 2 or 3 or 4 versions of a game in front of people, or versions of a feature, and then seeing which is most successful. And it works in the theory that everybody's the same, and that if we get a good thing and a bad thing, we go with the good thing. Now, ultimately, at the start, that's fine, but as you start to evolve the game, as you start to get a bigger user base, then you're going to have people who really like one version and people who really like the other version. And you really want to start to offer different choices. You want to start to personalize your game on a player basis, rather than expecting everybody to fit into the general view and work with what the majority like. So you have a kind of a one-size-fits-all problem with A/B testing. You also have, it's called the horizon effect, and that is that it looks so far ahead, but it doesn't look over it. So if you go and you make a choice, and you make an offer, you affect the game in a certain way that actually might be negative down the line. The next change might actually annoy those people who like the last change. So you can never really look too far ahead. You're looking at one-off choices. You're making game design decisions based on what the crowd thinks. The idea that overall, if people choose one, then they'll like it. And finally, funnel analysis. So funnel analysis is a tool that really came from the web space. It's great for linear technologies. It's great for understanding how people progress through a linear sequence, which is obviously what a website was. But it's actually not that good for games because games are much more complicated. They have different non-linear progressions, they have different paths, players play them in different ways. So you start to get into real complexity, and you end up trying to force everybody down a linear view of the world, that actually we just have one set of users that will play the game in one way, and that's the good way, and we're going to force everybody else down that route because that is how we've decided to build the game, because that's what our analytics is showing us. So we end up building games based on the tools we have rather than the other way around. So where does this go? What is the next steps in analytics? And we believe, games analytics, we believe there are 4 big things that are going to move this forward and really focus on games rather than bringing technology from other sectors like web. So behavioral segmentation. So rather than just segmenting the users on their age or their sex or when they started, let's actually understand their behaviors and segment them on their types of players. So are they social players? Are they struggling players? Lots of different kinds of segments. Social analytics. So rather than just simply looking at the people who spend money, start looking at how people are interacting, how they're interacting with each other, how they're forming gifting groups and communication groups, finding out where people sit within those groups. So looking at social influence, people who sit in the middle of groups pull people in, people who looking at what we call centrality, the position of somebody within a central group or a social group, looking at the cohesion factor of that group, how strong is that group? How do we reward people who aren't spending money but are holding the game together through the social influence? Also looking at bridging, how do you form bridges between different social groups? How do you encourage people to join social groups? So social analytics is really important because it's expanding from this 2% of players who spend money to about 20 or 30% of the players who are actually really vital to your game, who are influencing and encouraging people to spend money, but aren't actually spending money themselves. Then predictive modeling. So predictive modeling allows us to take this and start to predict player behavior. So rather than just looking at what people have done, we can start to predict people will do. We're starting to look at people who will fall out of the game, people who will abandon the game, people who will spend money. If you can start to predict ahead of time, this person, I think, will abandon the game in a week's time, then you can do something about it. There's no point in finding somebody's left the game because you've lost them. If you can predict they will leave the game, then you can offer something to keep them in the game. So using predictive methodologies is really, really powerful. And then ultimately, you have to talk to the user. So it only works if you have a way of getting back and using this analytics to directly talk to the user in the game at the point when it's important. So you need to be exactly at the right time with the right message to influence that user. So you help them over the struggling point that they have, help them to buy the right item. So we take metrics, segment the players, predict their behavior, and then you generate more value. So that's the core objective of what we're trying to do. And ultimately, if you can do that, you can actually increase the revenue, the enjoyment, the retention by 20 to 30%. So there's great value in that data if you can actually start to really use it. So who are my players? The key of this is that players are made up of lots of different kinds of groups. And each of those groups have different player behaviors. And starting to really understand those player behaviors, understand what is driving them, is really important. Now, in the social space, there's less differentiation. When you get into the casual MMO and the MMO space, you really start to see very strong different kinds of players, the warrior players, the social players, the grinders. You can really start to understand different kinds of behaviors at a game level rather than just at a social level. But understanding those player behaviors, understanding what is motivating those players, and then you can react and you can interact with them. So this is some work we've did on early play segmentation in a social game, which sounds kind of complicated. What we're doing here is we started looking at different kinds of players, from your early enthusiasts, your confident completers, your social players, right up to your players who are needing guidance or players who will just fall out of the game. So we start off by segmenting the player base into different kinds of players so we can understand what's motivating those players, and we can work out messaging and ways of interacting with each of those players. What's interesting about this is that we're not using standard metrics. We're not using what the player has done. we're using what the player will do. So we're using predictive metrics, so the revenue potential, how much this person will spend, and how socially involved this player is, rather than how much they have spent. So if you take the red blob, the needing guidance, these are players not needing guidance now. These are players that will need guidance if we don't do something about it. And that allows us to identify a set of players, understand the value of those players, and then understand a way of interacting with them to change that behavior, to move them from a group of players who will need guidance and will fall out of the game to a collection of players who will actually become much more confident, start playing the game, become more valuable. So once you understand the different types of players, you can start to predict what they want, and then you can use that information. And I use a picture of Cheers because it's a good example of a service-based industry. Here's a bar that knows your name. Here's a bar that as you walk in, they know exactly what pint you're going to drink, and they have it waiting for you so that they give you a good experience. Now, that's great. And they're doing that not because they like you, not because they think it's good. They're doing that because it helps them drive more revenue. They know that if they give you exactly what you want as you walk in through the door, then you will come back, because that's a good experience. And what we're trying to do with any kind of service industry, especially games, is we're trying to give players that experience. We're trying to give them something relevant and interesting and valuable at exactly the right point in time so they feel that it's a personalized experience, and they will come back and they will enjoy it and they will keep coming back to the game. So that is the core to it. Some of this is about monetization, some of it's about retention, but it's all about giving the user what they want at the right time. So how do we do this? Again, analytics, we build predictive models. We use a whole set of data mining tools to do this. What we're generally building is what's called multivariate models, which is taking a large set of events and identifying which of those events is predictive of a certain type of user. And each of these models allows us to target a set of users extremely precisely. So we're looking at 2 or 3% of users will be targeted by each model. And we're very confident that these users will have a high propensity, a high likelihood of taking up the offer that that model is looking at. So they'll be highly likely to be retained if it's a retention problem. So if we find a set of users who are struggling, we can identify them very, very precisely, and then we can make an offer, make a tutorial, make a help that will help them over that, and will actually move them to the next step. And I think this is a very kind of generalized predictive model. What we're doing here is we identify a whole set of variables that are predictive, and then we score users. And once we've scored the user, we can actually identify which of those users are likely to pick up that offer. This slide, this is quite a good slide. This is a piece of analysis we did on a social game. It was a kind of Cityville type game, and what we were looking at was where users were dropping out of the game. So what we found was about 1 to 2 weeks into the game, there was a set of users, about 5 to 10% of users, who would leave the game. They were engaged players. They were very involved, so they weren't falling out right at the beginning, but they were getting so far through the game, and then they were dropping out. And what we found was that within the first 100 to 150 events, so roughly the first 10 to 15 minutes of gameplay, we could identify very, very strong behaviors. We could identify players who were doing a certain type of behavior that was very predictive of those players dropping out. And those players would generally drop out, about a 90% likelihood that those players would have left the game within 2 weeks and would actually fall out between the 150 and 500 event period. And we could be very precise on that. And that's very powerful. In the first 10 or 15 minutes, if you can identify a set of users that will really struggle, then you can do something about it. So what we did was we then took that information, we allowed that to be run in real time, and then we could message and we could give those users a very precise set of tutorials that would solve the problems they had. And without giving other people tutorials that got in their way. So there was a lot of people who were fine, happily playing the game, didn't need this. We didn't have to give them the same tutorial. So that's about being precise. Using the data. I mean, we obviously collect huge amounts of data, finding out and identifying the complex decision paths. And then you can really start to optimize the gameplay. And this is where you can take this from just targeting and giving a user an offer to kind of the next opportunity with this. This is where you're starting to look at not just using it as a marketing initiative to identify and target people, but to actually say, well, actually, I can start to change the game based on this. If I understand my players much better, if I understand what they're doing, and I recognize there's lots of different kinds of players, then I can start to vary the game experience based on those behaviors. And this is really moving the experience from a game viewpoint, which is where most of us started. We were building games we wanted to play because we wanted to build this type of game, to a player perspective. How do our players play this game? And we recognize there's going to be lots of players, so we want to give them different kinds of experiences. Some focused on the social aspects of it, some focused on the completist or the killing aspect of it, but give them different kinds of viewpoints. There's some interesting areas on this when you start to look at the data protection, the privacy, exploitation. You have to be very careful. You have to be very careful that you're looking at just your data, that you are collecting it, that you are obviously informing users that this data will be used, and you're giving them a good experience. You're not using it to spam them and market to them and give them things they don't want. You're using this data constructively to improve the experience. So finally, if you can do adaptive gameplay, and this is where we, from Games Analytics, we believe this is where this is going to go, the ability to start to change and evolve and adapt the game based on the analytics that is driving it, based on this data. So you can actually start to really use the power of the data to generate new kinds of game concepts, games that are much more focused on different kinds of players. You can really start to alter the game. You can really build and drive player satisfaction. So we think that this is a huge opportunity to build a new type of game, a game that is driven by the data, still driven by the game design, but using that data in a positive way to actually alter the game based on different kinds of player behaviors. There you go.
Does anybody have any questions for Chris? Or maybe I'll start off with one. I noticed you brought your customers down into various different genotypes, early adopters, intermediate people. Do you have any data for how people start off in one and gradually migrate over? I can imagine a newbie starts in one category, you'll treat them in a certain way, but after a while they understand what's going on and they'll migrate from one genotype into another one. Do you have feedback about that?
We do. We've got some really good data on movement of players, so you do find that they will start and they'll congregate at very early specific segments and they'll start to split off. We've got some, that's a really simple segmentation. We get much more complicated. You start to see, depending on the game, you'll get people fixed into a very strong segment, and they'll follow a certain segment type down. So yeah, we have some. I don't have any to hand, but yeah, there's some really interesting data. And actually moving, these are not set. It's very easy to put these kind of graphs up and say, this is our segments. Actually, these are evolving things. Players will move between them, and you can encourage them just by, changing the game very slightly. You can move players from a struggling segment into a much more kind of fun playing segment, a completist segment.
Okay. Any more questions? Oh, one at the back. So can we repeat the question since we didn't have a microphone?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch it.
That might help. So. What's the time frame for the analysis? So how long does the customer have to be playing the game before you can categorize them in a certain genotype?
So that's interesting. I mean, when we start building the segments, we usually use 2 to 4 weeks worth of data to actually build the segments for a game. But actually, once we've got a robust model, so that example of the players dropping out, we could identify players within the game within the first 5 or 10 minutes of gameplay. So within the first 50 to 100 events, we could get a solid enough prediction that player. So building the models, you need quite a lot of data, about 4 weeks worth of data. But once you've got it, then you can actually predict those players very early, very quickly within the game experience.
So that's 100 events. How many points of data is that? How many?
It will be 100 events per player. So actually,
Right.
each of those. I mean, we collect in-game behavioral information, so it's significant events. It's building a building, it's destroying something, it's buying something. Those type of events. It's not just clicking around. So we're actually getting the data at the very start is really important. Getting robust data and understanding what the right kinds of data is that'll actually be predictive. And we spend quite a lot of time at the very start of a project working with the developer, working with the game to identify the robust data that's predictive. Once we've got that, then we can actually identify them very, very early. And you want to get rid of a lot of the noise, because these games will generate lots and lots of clicking around and confused. So building robust data at the very start is very important. It's kind of garbage in, garbage out type stuff.
Okay, I think we've run out of time for questions, but thank you again, Chris. And Mark's going to come up. We'll have about 5 minutes to set up, so please stay here.